And welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for Tracking Your Life, the Past, Present, and Future of Self-Monitoring with Dr. Zach Almquist of the Department of Sociology. We are so thrilled to have you present your research and to share more about this fascinating topic of self-monitoring in our digital age. So without any further ado, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Zach.
Thanks, Diana. I really appreciate being here, and hopefully everyone will find this informative and a little bit fun. So this is sort of one of those areas I've been interested in for a long time, ever since cell phones and stuff have started to become easy ways to track everything you do, for good or bad. A lot of this information on activities and then some of my own research. Overall, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So I'm going to start with some cute anecdotes on what I'm calling unintended consequences. Then I'm going to talk through sort of tracking in everyday life, a very brief cut history, some examples from my own quantified self kind of data, a little bit about the quantified self movement, and then I'm going to move into COVID-19 and tracking, which leads very nicely to citizen science and crowdsourcing. There I'm going to talk about a thing that I think is really cool, purple air. I'm also going to talk about some of my own work in Facebook disaster maps and social physical activity space, in this case, Strava. So in general, and then last, I'm going to conclude with a little bit of work on myself. All right. So first, these unintended consequences. So one app that I've done a bunch of work with is Strava. It's a biking, running app. It records your location via your cell phone. It can also be attached to other physical trackers like heartbeat and stuff. One of the things that it did for an advertising campaign is it released a worldwide map of everyone's biking and running activity as a heat map all over the world. And one of the unintended consequences of this was they outed some military bases because, well, it turns out that people who work in the military also like, exercising, and they like tracking their exercise. And so they're remote locations. Another sort of classic story on unintended consequences is the 2016 Target mailed coupons to a 16-year-old for pregnancy-related items, maternity wear, that sort of thing. They had this machine learning algorithm that suggested they might be needing things for babies. Now, of course, she hadn't told her parents that she was pregnant, and so this machine learning algorithm outed her via Target's coupon campaign. Unintended consequences. Another sort of classic story of unintended consequences is using something like Uber, right? You get to a place very easily. You have a nice phone-based app. You go and get a ride from location A to location B, super. Back in their more junior days, had a blog, and they did a number of things on this blog and just like basic analytics. Uber's had a lot of scandals, so there is an entire website dedicated to it if you're interested in finding more of these. But the basic thing was Uber staff had a blog where they analyzed passengers' rides to and from unfamiliar overnight locations, and then tabulated what Uber thought was one-night stands, and they termed Ride of Glory. And so this was where any rider who slept at a different location than their home from 10 to 4 a.m. on a Friday or Saturday, and then went a very short ride to their standard home. And so this is sort of a like unintended consequence that Uber had this sort of knowledge about its users, or at least thought it did. Another great example is the New York Times did this investigation on marketing data that you can buy just anywhere. We have a bunch of this data here at the University of Washington. SafeGraph provides it, as do other sort of marketing companies. And so here we have a cut of some of the data the New York Times bought. This is 10,000 smartphones tracked in Central Park. You can then isolate a single, say, smartphone, and then you can track everywhere it went in the New York area. And then you can build a diary of where the person went over the whole day, going everywhere from the person's home to like dropping off the kids at school, going to work, going out to get exercise in there, right? You can't hide. And so the New York Times did this great op-ed piece sort of showing how much you could pull from this marketing data. All right. So this gets us all kind of hopefully on the same page of like some of the things that are out there. They're not the most positive, but there are a lot of sort of positive applications, and that's kind of where we're moving to now. So first, I want to just talk a little bit about history of counting. And history of counting's been going on forever, as long as people have been able to like tabulate things in stone tablets or whatnot. But people have been doing various like tracking of themselves from moods to physical activity for a long time. And so I love this quote by John Bear. We live in an age of measurement, yet measurement is not something new. From the Doomsday Book to modern statistics, history is vital to understanding and intervening in the social world and to defining what is normal and what is deviant, oftentimes with material consequences. Or as some people have noted, right, what counts is counted. And so counting things can have like big impact on all sorts of things. So there's a lot of different places you could pull from history in quantified self, but I think one of the most interesting, like anecdotal basic one to look at is just weight measurement. So weighing people has been of interest and concern forever, right? People do it for aesthetic reasons, people do it for health reasons, and people do it for wartime rationing reasons. I think one of the things that's interesting is this classic picture of public scales. So back in the day, when having a scale in your own home was too expensive or impractical, there were public scales that people could just go and use to weigh themselves around for hundreds of years. So one of the things that happened with the focus on weight is that actuaries and insurance companies got really interested in knowing what they could do with it. So an insurance company established welfare divisions designed to implement programs aimed at extending the average lifespan of policyholders, looking to improve people's both mortality and morbidity. And so they generated, Metropolitan Life Insurance generated these height to weight tables and a basic like target frame, like you want to be within this sort of weight category. And if so, you will live longer. And so in pushing the people who held their policy to try to get with of their population by almost 5.5 years. So fairly impressive. And of course, this is what leads to modern day BMI calculations, and why, it became such a big deal is there was this demonstration that height and weight had some ability to predict your mortality, right? And if you kept within these bands, it seemed to imply that you could live longer. And so this has become like a really standard measure. There's all sorts of controversies about BMI. I'm not advocating for BMI. I just think this is a really interesting historical point where we get from like traditional tracking of weight to modern day BMI. All right, so this is where I want to like shift us to just cute examples from my own life. So things that like are either very actively or inactively tracked on myself. So things like social media, right? Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, LinkedIn, all track my activity. Fitness trackers tend to require a little more activeness. Google Fit, Fitbit, Runkeeper, Strava. Other things that record you passively and that can be interesting to look at are things like music and reading. So Spotify, Last.fm, Goodreads, that sort of thing. So over here, we have my runs in and around San Francisco. Here we have my Google location history for the year 2017. You can see I was in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, LA a lot, but also Minneapolis, Midwest, East Coast a bit. It's a whole year of travel. So a brief, like just sanity check, it turns out you can download all your Google location history data, simple quality measure that's easy to pull off. So you can see the like highly accurate to the less accurate data. You can see how tight the bands range from day, month, or year. An easy thing to notice and point out is that Alaska, I've never been to Alaska. I would really like to go to Alaska. But Google's location history thinks I've been to Alaska, as well as some like odd parts in Canada, which I unfortunately have not been to. Is this because I left my cell phone on when I flew in an airplane? Is this just because sometimes the data really is that bad? On average, it seems like the data is quite good, but there are definitely some noise. All right, here is Runkeeper. I've used Runkeeper as my running journal for a super long time. So I've totaled about a little over 5,000 miles and 1,000 creature of habit. So you can see I do the Bert Gelman a lot in Seattle. Excuse me. Another app that I've been using a lot lately is Fitbit. Fitbit records a ton of things. They give you a score for how good your sleep is. I have very small kids, so my sleep score is never good. But they track like your steps, they track your heart rate. It can be a pretty interesting like activity. It can be a lot of fun. Another sort of like fun thing to do is Spotify. If you listen to music on Spotify, has an API, you can download your history. So for example, here I downloaded my top 5 songs. Everything is Blaze and the Monster Machines. You can see that my 5-year-old has been maybe the most heavy user of my Spotify account in the last year. But in general, this sort of thing of like seeing what you like and then like analyzing it can be a lot of fun. All right. So I want to shift us from my activities and what impacts sort of our everyday life to this like social movement within the quantified self, which is also, I think, impacted very heavily by this ability to have like easy self trackers. So it's become, relatively popular where people are using cell phones, watches, buying more expensive equipment, and tracking them either for entertainment or self-improvement. And so the larger movement has this very like scientific basis. And you iterate and try to hack yourself to improve yourself using all of this data acquisition and analysis. So what has really made this quantified self movement tractable in the modern world? Well, sensors, of course. So you have GPS, but you have hats, wrists, socks, shoes, eyeglasses, lots and lots of wearables. You also have lots of data warehouses, analysis techniques. Hospitals are getting involved, insurance companies. There's building up this huge ecosystem. But what do people do with this quantified self? Well, one of the things people do, because people are social, is they gather together in meetups and they present on their own experiences. They talk about how they've measured themselves, what they've learned from it. why they do it. And this is like a pretty cool activity. And so like meetups even in Seattle are like a big thing, right? So like the just, meetup.com's quantified self has over 1,000 members in Seattle. Example pulled from the literature on food consumption, and people can be like extremely clever, right? Their histogram is French fries. And these go from all sorts of things, from like food to even like blood tests. All right, so there's been this big explosion in self-tracking, but how big is it really? Well, there haven't been as many surveys on this as I would like, but back in 2013, so quite a while now, Pew did a survey on how much people are self-tracking. And so over 60% of adults said that they're tracking their weight, diet, or exercise routine. About a third of people track more complex things like blood pressure, blood sugar, headaches, sleep patterns. And over 10% of the US are tracking health indicators for family members or other people they care about. So like a lot of people were doing this, almost 10 years ago. It is certainly higher now. So 49% of trackers say that they keep track of progress in their heads. 34% say they keep track data on paper, notebook, or journal, and 21% are using health-related apps. My guess is that these numbers in the technology space are way higher now. And so you see like all these different things, and some of it gets like really nuanced, right? Glucose monitors. And this is done by people with and without diabetes, interestingly enough. All right, so 46% of trackers say that this activity has changed their overall approach to maintaining their health or the health of someone they provide care for. 40% of trackers say it has led them to ask a doctor a new question or to get a second opinion. 34% of trackers say it affects a decision about how to treat an illness or condition. People are using it for their health. And so in this vein, right, more recently, Pew asked a poll about Americans on whether it's acceptable to give fitness tracker data to medical researchers. So the majority say it is okay, 35% say it's not, and 22% don't know how they feel about it. So this is like pretty standard, and it varies quite a bit by race and gender. All right, so all of this comes together, right, into sort of how quantified self can be or might impact the health industry in the long run. So more and more people are having access to genomic data. Think 21andMe kind of information. We have all this self-reported quantified self data. And all of this is sort of coming together to produce big health, personal health. And so people can do this at a very, very personal level, and they can also do this integrated with their healthcare professional. All right, so just sort of my last sort of comment on the community. It is a big community. It's broken up over a lot of different things. One of the places that exists is in social media. So Reddit, for example, is a network of communities where people can dive into their interests, hobbies, and passions. There is a quantified self community in Reddit, and people use it for sharing all sorts of stuff. And so here I've just pulled the top 100 pages and done a very simple topic model in a little word cloud, right? And so you can see that a lot of it is, as well as like how to collect data, how to use new equipment, and that sort of thing, right? So it's really a place for people who want to start. All right. So the last thing I kind of want to talk about in examples from everyday life is COVID-19. I think this has been a big one for all of us. So COVID-19, right, came on pretty suddenly, and a lot of sort of aggregate trace data, both for individual use and for larger public health use, has been used by tracking. So for example, Google Trends, right, displays who is looking for an idea the most. So if you look at COVID-19, right, there's a massive spike around April of 2020. And then, it comes out and then cascades down. We have lots of tracking COVID-19, whether it be things like symptom tracking, providing people place to shelter, looking at changes in behavior, that sort of thing. So for example, Fitbit, which, you know, tracks a lot of health measures, they did a big study to see how well Fitbit could be used to predict if somebody has COVID-19 with a fair bit of success. SafeGraph and other of these marketing tools that are all of this like physical movement data was used to show how well rules happen, like how much people social distance, how much well people were following basic guidance of like shelter in place, as well as these sort of things were later used to, you know, tell people if they were near someone with COVID-19 at some point. Other sort of big data things that I think are interesting, that is, I think, very much in this quantified self movement, is classic surveys. Surveys have been used for things like mood and other things, but in this case, this was a massive survey run over the Facebook platform that asked people about whether they were experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and provided a worldwide sort of measure of people's symptom experience of COVID-19. And this has a very special issue in PNAS. It's very cool. I recommend looking through it. And this group, the COVID-19 survey, released lots of information. One of the things that was, of course, very impressive about it is that it's worldwide. And then they also community risk levels, whether they're choosing to get vaccinated, etc. Other things that came up, right, was misinformation campaigns. So Google and other groups tried to improve news and make sure that their tailored ads were both helpful and sort of in line with what people needed to protect themselves as best they could. And then Google and Apple also worked together for contact tracing, both to report when somebody has COVID-19 and then to let people know who are physically around that person. And so I'm sure many of you during COVID-19 were asked on your app if you wanted to participate in the program. These sort of things were, you know, this is all tracking. All right, so I think this is a really nice shift to citizen science and crowdsourcing, right? So like all these individual tracking, when they're aggregated by researchers, can then be used for other activities. And this is done both at sort of, say, the amateur level and the professional research level. All right, so one of, I think, the interesting intersections of self-tracking in the amateur and professional area, and this is sort of like citizen science area, is Purple Air. All right, so Purple Air is super cool. It's this service that allows you for fairly cheap to buy either an indoor or an outdoor air sensor, and then you can connect it up to a network system of other people who use Purple Air. And so what this allows for is a very localized air quality sensor all over your city. You know, one of the things that's really nice about this is, let's say we have massive forest fires on the West Coast and you're curious if the air quality in your neighborhood is bad, not just the airport. Well, you can look, you can go onto Purple Air, you can look in your neighborhood and you can see sort of a standard air quality measures report. And so people use this all over. They're very cool. You can get one yourself. And so they provide this big network and community of air quality sensors all over the world. All right, so how else could this be used? How are like researchers using Purple Air? Well, Purple Air in Africa is a pretty cool idea. So air quality is extremely important. It affects things like asthma, it affects things like sleep, it affects quality of life in all sorts of important ways. Better air is better for your life. How do you guarantee that you have better air in a policy situation? Well, you have to measure. So Africa is one of those areas where there is not a huge level of high quality air measurement. And so this set of researchers got together and they focused on Nigeria, and they took a bunch of purple airs and they distributed them all over the country. And so you can see the data they collected, and so they could see where places had better quality air, whether they could use the Wi-Fi system or whether they had to use the SD card manually. Almost everywhere they had to do the SD card. That's the cool thing about Purple Air, is while it is generally built for this wireless deployment, it works just totally fine of like recording, downloading, loading up somewhere else. And so these researchers have been leveraging their findings to push policymakers in Africa to clean up air. And this is like something we want everywhere, right? More high quality air recording to remind people of how good the air could be and helping inform policy to improve it. All right, here is some work that I've been involved in, although this is a really big project, Facebook disaster maps. So disaster maps is this really cool data for good product from Facebook, where what they do is post a disaster. They measure, generally speaking, in sort of a safety conscious way, where people have moved around after the disaster. So there's lots of reasons why this might be interesting. The big and main one for the Data for Good project is that they have a bunch of NGO collaborators and the UN, and they use it primarily to give these NGOs a sense of where they should be deploying resources. So how did disaster maps come about? This is sort of like pretty cool idea. So what happened was back in 2010, some researchers got a bunch of cell phone data and showed that they could figure out where people went after the Haitian earthquake. And they could do this pretty well and pretty fast. Now, that's pretty cool, right? There are, in principle, cell phones everywhere, but it turns out getting access to cell phone data and using it in this sort of context is extremely expensive and extremely hard to do. You have to make contracts with every cell provider all over the world. There's hundreds and thousands of these providers, and everyone has different agreements, and many of them don't want to share data for all kinds of reasons. Now, people in the Data for Good space at Facebook realized that, you know, here is a space where Facebook could really do something cool, because Facebook represents about a third of the world population. It covers huge geographic space, and they don't have to make individual contracts with everyone. So they can actually respond to disasters all over the world relatively quickly and provide really useful information to NGOs. What kind of information can they provide? This location of where people move. Why might these groups care? Well, they need to decide where to distribute relief supplies. They need to decide where to put up Wi-Fi hotspots. They need to estimate the reach of emergency communications. Are they getting to all the people who might have been moved? And what about collective drives for relief response? Where do you send them? Where should that stuff go? All of these things are really complex tasks, and they require fairly fine-grained, immediate knowledge of where people are moving around. All right, so how can Facebook provide this information? Well, it has a large population, it has movement patterns, and it has a fair bit of information also about outages in mobile phone service, which can be a really important service for these NGOs. And then you can estimate what they call long-term displacement, which is displacement over 3 days, and they can give a general sense of where they go. All right, so all of this is built on, or at least all this used to be built on Facebook's location history data. This is an opt-in setting in the Facebook app, and it gives high frequency, high precision location data, just like cell phone data. Historically, it's been around 15% of Facebook users. It's only kept for a couple of months, so it's only really useful for immediate disasters. But once it's aggregated, it can be saved for researchers. All right, so this gets back to that basic question, right? Where are people going? What places are most affected? And where should we do resources? So what can this data do? So here's like a good visualization of the tiling of where people are moving around. Where do I come in and where have I interacted with this data? I have looked at sort of augmenting this data with surveys. So why would you augment this data with surveys? Well, the pro, right, is that we can provide mapping of displaced individuals at various geographic scales. We can do it very quickly. Sometimes you can attach some basic information like demographics. However, it's very rare that you can get good demographic data. There's never economic data. It can be very noisy and it can be biased because of who has their location history on. So how might you improve that? Well, one way is to survey users. So before I shift to the part of the project that I was quite involved in, I want to tell just I was displaced. This is not unlike the sort of algorithms, right, that Uber used. What they do is they look to see where you have your standard home. And then if you are post-disaster, very quickly post-disaster in a new location for at least 3 days, then you're declared displaced in that location. All right, so let's look at 2 examples. The first is Cyclone Fani in 2019. This is a really important case for the Facebook data for good maps. One, it was a really big disaster, a lot of fatalities, billions in damages, millions of people moved around. Disaster maps provided almost real-time movement for this data. And you can see where people left really quickly and then their return. And so one of the like quality signals that the data for good team did was they can Memorial Day versus Cyclone Fani, and you indeed see like a lot of structure, right? So it's a very different set of people are moving for vacation versus moving because of the disaster. All right, so you see this like big activity. So what we did was about 6 months later, we surveyed everyone and asked them about their experience. So of the Facebook users in Cyclone Fani region who reported being displaced at least one day due to Cyclone Fani was around 71%. So this was a massive disaster, moved a lot of people around. The percent of Facebook users in Cyclone Fani region who reported being displaced at least one day, about 66%, haven't returned yet in 6 months was about 18%, and about 16 didn't want to provide us with information. And the reasons range from like, my home is not livable, to finding new opportunities, to not being allowed to return, to other issues. And so that's the sort of information that you can't get from the automated collection, right? But one of the things you can do, right, and this is really part of the self-tracking, right, is we can deploy individualized surveys over these social media forums very quickly. So this is pretty cool. So lots of limitations, lots of future work, but a very like interesting area of research. I also get another disaster, 2019-2020 bushfire. This was 2 major fires in Australia. This caused billions of dollars of damage. And lots of people were displaced. All right. So what we did was about 2 months after the disaster, we ran a large survey, a few thousand people, again, administered on the Facebook platform. So very individualized. And so what did we get? We got about 7,000 users in the affected area, and about 25% of them were displaced. And most people were displaced a short time, less than a week. The next big set is 2 weeks. And then there were a few people who were still displaced at the time when the survey was conducted. All right, so just a general sense of how well a survey can work on social media. It can work quite well. So one thing, right, there is no attempt to like reweight this to the greater Australia population. So what we get is a sample that very much looks like the Facebook population, but is not like wildly off from the Australia census. But there are some big things to note, right? It's more women in the population. We get more people at working age and less people at the like 70+ category. But with a little bit of work, one thing that we can do that I think is pretty cool is you can aggregate this up and you can make an from this disaster. So for example, if you look at the Cuttle Creek fire in Adelaide Hills in Australia, using these methods, we estimate almost 18,000 people were displaced, ranging from about 17,700 to a little over 18,000. To compare this to another measure, the Red Cross put a lower bound of people displaced at 17,000. So this is producing something that's really well aligned with the Red Cross's estimate. All right, so just some takeaways. We can look at gender differences of where people left, whether they stayed in their local region or went to other people's homes, different states, etc. We can look, again at how long people were away. We can look at things like mask usage. Now, note this is all pre-COVID-19. I would expect people's knowledge about masks to be much, much higher today. But we do see, at least in people's self-reported comfort with masks, a big difference between males and females. Okay. Big takeaway, right? We have these automated means using self-tracking to disasters, but we can use some classic methods like surveys to really improve how useful that information is. So I think the future on a lot of these things is going to be self-reported combined with these link traced kind of data. All right. Next, I want to talk about some more research that I've been involved in the social physical activity space. This one, I'm going to talk about Strava. I was really interested in working on Strava with my colleague here at the University of Washington at the I School in the Spiro. And then a lot of this work is done with Emma's student who just graduated, Lee Zhang. Congratulations, Lee. And what we were really interested in when we started this project was peer influence and its effect on physical activity. Right. So we started looking at Strava because it advertised itself as the Facebook of physical activity apps. It has lots of social interaction. You can share kudos, you can share pictures, you can talk to people, you can share when you're doing physical activities. But it also has all those cool things in your cell phone, right, where it records whether you run or bike and where you went and all of those physical activities that you do offline. So this basic question, right? How does online socializing impact offline and physical activity? So this is this very cool research space where we can intersect online and offline behavior using these behavioral trace data. So we started out asking a couple basic questions. Does social demographic characteristic structure emerge in online fitness communities? Do women and men generate different fitness communities? And then we had a follow-up question about structured co-presence. So how does online behavior affect whether you run in groups? That sort of question. So again, I just want to talk a little bit why Strava. Strava has lots and lots of information that they track on you. You create a lot of trace data when you use it, and that's not just physical, but it's also social. So originally when we collected this data, we did it from Strava's API. They have this API where you can pull activities, mostly for sort of third-party apps. However, if you do this very carefully, you can unwind these activity base to generate a weighted random sample of user activity. And so we can look a little bit about what this sample provides. Activity, right, goes way up between when we started in 2010 to 2016 when we stopped doing this. We get things about running, biking, swimming. We get their physical location. We get information about their moving time, achievements, demographics, etc. One thing to note is that Strava is historically a bike app. It turns out that biking is a heavily white male-dominated sport. And so Strava's core user base is very male. All right, and then we can see this in other ways. So here you can see that it's primarily used for running and biking, and that males really dominate the set. All right, so one of the things we did was we took various statistical models and we looked to understand difference in how males and females generate their social network. And they generate very, very different social networks. So we can show that males, at least on this app, are generating things by what is called preferential attachment. They're going out and they're finding the most active people, the people with the biggest social networks, where females are consistently doing a two-stage process where they're finding other women and then they're finding active people within the women doing it. So you get, maybe a very different use, maybe a different motivational use, maybe this like larger sort of just preference for same gender because of how small a group of women are on Strava. So you might imagine if Strava becomes bigger and becomes more inclusive gender-wise, that we'd see a change in how people are building their social networks on the platform. All right, so this kind of leads to another question, which is just like group activity use and sort of quality of exercise activity. And so one of the things that is very cool with Strava is you can see when people are running together. So most people run in groups of size 1, but the next largest is, of course, pairs, and then it goes up in groups. But one thing you see is a big difference. So women are more likely to run alone. Men are more likely to run in groups. Women are more likely to run in larger groups. And we have like a general finding that as you get to about like 4 or 5 people maximize their running activity. From the physical like heart rate monitors and stuff, we can see that seems to be like the peak. And then as you include more people, it just sort of levels off. We can also see sort of interesting effects from social activities like likes and sharing pictures. All of these things encourage people to at least record their activity more on Strava. All right, so I've published a bunch of work on this with my colleagues Emma and Lee. And so this is just sort of a list of that work for people who want to look into it more. All right, and so with that, we're coming towards the end of the talk. I want to talk about my future work in this sort of activity-based space. I'm looking to combine 2 of my main research goals right now. One goal is focusing on people experiencing homelessness. So looking at how to better count and better improve people's access and quality of life for those experiencing homelessness. And so one of the ways to look into this is to focus on health measures. And so with Horatio and Melanie, we just got a Population Health Initiative Tier 1 grant to do a pilot study on looking at people's sleep patterns and when they're experiencing homelessness. And so we're going to be able to look at different treatment spaces. So Horatio did some work looking at the effects of being homeless and sleeping in shelters, and it's very noticeable. It disrupts people's sleep patterns a lot. But the question is like, how well do you say sleep patterns improve in hotels or in sanctioned tent villages or unsanctioned tent villages? And so we can think about all of these treatments that people do to try to improve the lives of people experiencing homelessness. And we can see, does it have a positive, negative, or null effect on their sleep patterns? So I'm very excited about this grant, and I'm hoping it will do a lot of good to the world. So with that, I am done. This is the end of the slide, and we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Zach. Yeah, we'll start fielding questions. If you have any question that you want to put in the chat box, you're more than welcome to, or simply go unmute. This is an open space for us to explore, discover.
I suspect we've all been on Zoom a lot at this point of the pandemic. Everybody's like,
All right. There is a question that came in. Which devices appear to be the most accurate for tracking sleep?
So I was talking to a ratio about this. There are these rings out now. It turns out the rings are highly superior to like the wristwatches. Wristwatches are great because they're cheap and they're easy to replace. I use it myself for my own personal sleep tracking, and it's what is used most commonly in the sleep tracking research. But I think there's going to be a big move to ring-based tracking. It's a lot higher quality. You don't lose it. It stays much more steady. So that definitely seems to be the future.
Fascinating. And I was personally curious, you are teaching a course on this subject matter next quarter and in the following year. Could you tell us a little bit about this course and what you'll be covering and what you aim to explore?
Yeah, I'm unfortunately not teaching it next quarter. I taught it last year and will hopefully be teaching again next year. The challenge of scheduling is always tough. Although I do teach a little bit of this in my Data for Society class, which I teach almost every year, which is a very cool class. I really like the self-tracking quantified self class. So we do I do a lot more on the history and philosophy and like ethics. And then we have a big lab component. So I provide a bunch of data for people to analyze, or they can analyze their own data depending on their comfort level. And so we talk about how to download all this data. Almost all of it is super accessible, which is sort of amazing. You can just go onto your Google profile and you can download all of your location history, all of the marketing data that like Google provides an aggregate to all these people. You can get your individualized data. And so you can grab it and you can look through it. You can map it. You can do regression models. You can play with it. Same with Fitbit. You can download all of that data. They have a great API. So if you're using R or Python, you can pull all of your data and you can start looking at it. You can pull like little pieces. You can look to see what correlates. It's pretty amazing what you can do. And so the class is sort of like two pieces. One is like talking about and seeing all of the places we're tracked and how it's changing society and what we're doing with it, the good and the bad. And then there's this big like just analytic component of like, it's more fun to learn analysis when it's your own data, when it's on yourself and your own like person.
Fascinating. Well, thank you for sharing that course, and hopefully you can come back next year. So that's really neat. The questions are pouring in. What concerns do you have about identified data being used for purposes that don't support the individual?
I think there's a lot of ethical challenges around this, and a lot of it intersects with where stuff's shared, right? So the classic example is what I call the pizza delivery problem. Which is you have a pizza delivery boy or girl, pizza delivery person who is delivering pizza around, and they happen to have a route that goes through a bunch of people who are engaged in, say, like drug trafficking. And then, the FBI or someone else gets access to this recorded data because it's on the person's like cell phone and the route they went. And they see that this person is tightly linking all of these different drug traffickers, and then they get, pulled up and then, maybe even prosecuted based on this data. So like, it's not really targeting the individual. This person is just randomly getting pulled out of this correlation of data and getting in trouble. And I think there's a lot of concern about just random people getting inappropriately pulled because their privacy just isn't there. So if it's like shared in the wrong way across different groups, there's a lot of potential problems. And so if your data's in there right, you could get picked up on that sort of thing. And this goes across all sorts of things from like, people use credit ratings now to decide if you can rent a house. And so like if your data gets intermingled with someone else's data, then all of a sudden you have trouble renting or borrowing money. So all of these things are like highly problematic, and how well they're siloed and whether they can only be used for one thing or they can then be used for multiple things is where like stuff gets really tricky. And so there are like lots of good things that came out of it, right? Like the contact tracing has probably been very good for public health. If it's shared in an appropriate way, it's not like too wildly invasive, and hopefully that like reminder makes you less likely to get people sick and like in general world benefit. On the other hand, right, if we had been a more draconian country and we were using that tracking to like, you know, imprison you until your quarantine area was over, that might have felt like a giant overreach on that data. So I mean, I think there is no good answer other than you have to be like really thoughtful about what's being tracked and what it means for you and how like vigilant you should be. There's this great set of articles by a sociologist who tried to not be tracked during her pregnancy. And so she stopped using like all social media. She stopped carrying a cell phone. She stopped, you know, government IDs. She like did the whole like works. And what she said was it was super hard. It was massively inconvenient. Friends worried about her, and like basically she ended up offending a bunch of her friends, and then it made her look like a criminal because like she wasn't in all of these other spaces. So like the ability to not be involved is really, really hard now. So that's like a kind of not helpful answer to your question, which is just that like it's there, lots of it's tracking, it's happening all the time. You have some impact you can have on it, and you mostly just have to be like really thoughtful and careful, and there's limits to what you can do.
Fascinating. And I'm not sure if you touched base on that. You spoke on like the, you know, issues that can arise from not being tracked. Are there concerns about sharing all of your activity data with other apps like Sweatcoin? For example, how these companies might be using that data?
I think so. I personally spend a lot of time actively siloing my various things, at least making them have to like actively pay and work really hard to like connect the data, and probably introducing some error. People range on how much effort they're willing to do on stuff like that. I saw one question was like, what is the future of self-tracking? So some of this is really already being done now, but grocery stores and other places you shop will do like Bluetooth sniffing and stuff to try to figure out where you are all over the grocery store and how long you spend like looking at items. I think you're going to see a lot more eye tracking and a lot more just very fine-grained spatial location anytime you're in public space. The city of Seattle has also done a lot of work in that area, and I think you're going to see both governments and private groups doing more and more just very fine-tooth stuff, both physical space, but also starting to like try to like track your eyes. That's like one that's like fairly underutilized, but there's like the technology is getting much better.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Is there any interest or expansion of the medical tracking abilities of devices beyond sleep that we can expect?
I mean, there's a ton of interest. I know among people experiencing diabetes that there's like a growing community, especially for like tracking your blood, but and also reminding you like when to take medicine. All of that sort of falls under this, but also using it for just like basic health. You know, digital food diaries, while still a giant pain, are much easier than the traditional paper and pencil.
Mm-hmm.
And so like all of those things, some of it's good and bad, right? So you can imagine a lot more personalized health with your doctor, which seems really good. You can imagine a lot more personalized health with your insurance carrier, which seems much worse. The metaphor being, there already are car insurance companies, right, that will track your car. And if you don't go over like too fast and you don't go too far, they'll decrease the cost of your insurance. But you could do those same things with the human body, right? So that's like a potential grim future out there.
Right. What are we not tracking now that may come in the future? not sure if you, I'm sorry, did you just answer that? Yeah.
I answered that one a little bit.
A bit ago, it was weaved
Yeah.
in, sorry. I guess alongside that, how does public tracking push against civil rights in the US?
So I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. The intersection of like what you make public, say on your social media or your physical movement space, places where governments can get access to your physical movements if you're trying to gather and the government doesn't want you to gather, can be quite draconian. We haven't seen a lot of this in the US, and I don't know if we will or won't. But you have seen a lot of this in Asian countries, especially South America, where like, you know, the governments use or try to get access to these platform information or just the cell information if it's a national cell plan to intersect and disperse people. So there's a lot of potential for it to be problematic. And it kind of, again, depends on how the public and personal sphere end up intersecting.
Right. And I saw this question and wanted to save it because it was good. What strategies would you recommend for opting into something like a data for good collection program versus data collection for targeted marketing and advertising? Example being used here is one wouldn't mind their data being tracked to contribute to the Facebook disaster mapping, but aren't so thrilled about all of the advertisements.
So in the survey space, it's like very clean because there's always a consent form, and the consent form makes it very clear. This is a data for good project. We're doing X, Y, and Z. We'd love for your information that will be used for the following, like data for good kind of project. So lots of times there are like very clear opt-in options for that. Some things, because they're kind of done post hoc, there is no good way to opt in or opt out. It's just like whether you're actively using the thing that they're gonna build from. Disasters are a good example of that one, right? We don't know where disasters are gonna occur. We don't know kind of like if you're likely to be in that location. But there are things like Facebook has the like I'm safe thing, and that's a data for good project, and that's they do use that for NGOs a lot, and it's never used for marketing. So those sorts of things, they'll usually tell you if they're just data for good products. So if they like are clearly labeled that way, they won't be used for anything other space. Other things, it's just kind of, there is no good way, unfortunately, because it's all done sort of post hoc.
Right. Fascinating. Well, we are nearing the end of our event. If there aren't any other questions, yeah, we can wrap up our event. Thank you again so much, Dr. Almquist. This was incredibly fascinating, and yeah, we look forward to hearing more from your work. Again, we will be sending out this recording for folks to rewatch or share across our network. If anyone wants to get a hold of Dr. Zach Almquist, his information is also going to be sent out in the follow-up email. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with?
Oh, just thanks everyone for coming out. It's nice to, you know, talk to everyone and get a chance to share some of the things I work on and worry about.
And also get excited for. Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. It's great to see you all.